Joseph Tennant. He's a research associate on the Mystical Experiences and Temporal Lobe Epilepsy Project. So Joe is actually working with Alistair Coles and some other people as well. That's Alistair you heard from on the very first day of this course. And he will, I'm sure, be telling you more about his own results and so on, his own research. He received his PhD in comparative human development from the University of Chicago. He's a cultural psychologist specializing in the psychology of religion and morality. And so he's now going to talk to us about religious experience and the brain. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you, Dennis. How are we on sound? Everyone feel like can hear me? We good in the back? Wonderful. So thank you, Dennis, for that very kind introduction. So I'm going to be presenting on sort of 3 key ideas here for the course of this talk. Idea number 1 is looking at the neurology of religious experience and looking at how neurology focuses a lot on location and on integration, which I'll break down in a moment. We're going to talk about the psychology of religious experience. We're going to look at constructs and association. Again, I'll explain. And then I'll talk a bit about the project Dennis mentioned. I'm working on with Professor Alistair Coles, Dr. Sophia Erickson, and Professor Joanna Collicutt on mystical experience, looking at sort of our aims for the project and some preliminary data that's fairly hot off the presses. So I'm looking forward to seeing how I remember to present that. So let's talk about the neurology of religious experience. And I want to talk about location and this sort of general question. I think this is what a lot of us think about when we look at neurology, this where in the brain does it live idea. So neurology has a tradition of looking at the brain either in places where it doesn't work, such as the Phineas Gage study that Harvey mentioned earlier today, or looking at essentially saying, please do X, and then looking to see where the brain activates while X is happening. And this approach yields a tremendous amount of results, but also has a tendency towards reductionism, as I'll explain in the example coming up. And so this is just one tool neurology has, the other being integration. And this is leveraging knowledge of systems we already understand, and then asking, systems we already understand, and asking how those might be associated with the experience we're interested in. So you say something like, we know the amygdala is involved in emotion. For this emotional phenomenon, do we expect to see things happening, and do they relate to other areas besides the amygdala? Again, the examples will make that a little more clear. But my point is to say that this is the things neurology is very good at when studying something like religious experience. So let's talk about Michael Persinger's mystical helmet, which sounds a lot neater than the actual title of the paper. So Michael Persinger and company, they are interested in religious experience, and they're very much in this sort of location God spot tradition. So in the paper that I had up there, they literally built a motorcycle helmet that has 2 weak magnets on either side. Alistair may have described this a little bit. And they had a single participant who was a musician, age 45, who had what he called a haunting. They had some sort of ghost-like experience. So they put him in this helmet, and they did intermittent blasts of this magnetic force onto his temporal lobes. And they did that for about 20 minutes, and they asked him the various experiences he had, and they asked him whether he liked them or not. And they reported what experiences were present. The common ones that they emphasized in the study were that he had the similar sensations to the ghost feeling. He had a sense presence in the room. And he also had a sense of emotional calm, a sense of serene relaxation that was sort of brought on by the experience of these magnets. And that's really helpful because that tells us that the temporal lobe is important for some of the things associated with religious experience. Now, there's a problem with that, in that I think for many people, ghosts and religion are not quite the same thing. And so that method of study of treating religion as this broad category of odd experience, I think is very limiting in what the conclusions you can make. And unfortunately for Michael Persinger, in my opinion, I mean, this is interesting research, he has gone this reductionist route a bit and has argued that all religious experience can be explained as micro seizures in the temporal lobe, which I think many people would find a little concerning as a conclusion. Also unreported is my favorite symptom this person had from the helmet, which is the urge to burp, and then in parentheses, patient burped, which I think is kind of a fun thing to mention. Now we're going to talk about Newberg's monks, and Alistair discussed this study a little bit. So this is the study in which they had monks, in this case Buddhist tradition monks, meditating in a room, and then they did a scan on the brain while meditating. So the structure was they had people in baseline kind of just relaxed. They gave them an injection. They looked at the way the brain looked under that injection, and then they said begin meditating. They meditated, and when they hit sort of what they would consider the peak experience, they had a signal that they'd integrated into the prayer. And then they got an injection that began from the other room. Alistair made it sound like they ran in and stabbed them with a needle. That's not quite what happened. It was more of a subtle injection. And then they observed the changes in blood flow that occurred between sort of baseline and then during meditation. And what they predicted was that you would see decreased blood flow to the superior parietal lobe, superior parietal region. And basically, they're looking to say that that's where you're going to see the loss of the sense of time, the loss of the sense of self, the things we associate with the unitary views within Buddhism. And you see an increase in the frontal cortex because they're working very hard to meditate. They kind of found another of those things, but this is a very interesting look at the way the brain changes during meditation. So it's very nice, and I like it better than Persinger's study in the sense that it looks at very deliberate religious practice. These are monks who are experts, they're good at what they do, and studying them rather than just some person who said they saw a ghost once, I think is more productive for teaching us about the neurology of religion. However, it has a pretty poor external validity. Believe it or not, this is the most friendly way to study this phenomenon. They tried it with fMRI. When people are in a tight space with whirling magnets, they tend to not feel very spiritual, weirdly enough. And then these are also atypical groups. So, and this is not to say something mean about the Buddhist monks, but these are very specialized types of meditation by expert people. And so this is interesting, but it doesn't generalize well. And when you're trying to make a mechanistic claim about neurology, I worry about using a very specialized group like that. I think it's informative, but it's not complete. So we're going to move on to the psychology of religious experience, in part because I'm running out of time relative to my talk. And we're going to talk about constructs for a second. So psychology's main method for studying things is to create a construct of it, to operationalize something that we theorize is the actual mechanism. So something like attitudes are very difficult to measure in a jar. I don't know if you've ever tried. It's hard. You can't do it. And so you have to create a self-report scale. Now, there's lots of ways psychologists have gotten very good at making sure the self-report scales are consistent, but we are relying on constructs. And we're looking to abstract out mind stuff, is a nice way to put it, things of the mind, into, so like in religion, for example, spirituality, devotion, into scales that we can compare them to other things. And association is the other major tool of psychology of religion. So we're going to take these constructs we've created, and we're going to relate them to outcomes in other scales. So a couple of examples of this are Big Gods and Watchful Eyes. So this is R. Norzane's book, Big Gods, and the line of research associated with it. So R. Norzane, he had this large idea that there are certain mechanisms of human psychology that would lead people to see omniscient gods as much more feasible than other forms of religion. We can break that down a bit more later, but one of the things I found really interesting about this is he looked at the psychology of being watched and saw its effects on behavior and on people's attitudes and found some very powerful, interesting effects. So for example, when you put a pair of eyes, like a wall in front of a computer and have someone do a task, people who have the eyes in front of them are less likely to cheat. The act of being observed actually has a profound behavioral effect on morality. And this, so they did this with Think About God, and people were more moral thinking about God. Interestingly, atheists were more moral thinking about God because that notion of being watched ended up changing their social behavior. So this is a really interesting way of approaching the subject of religion. There's behavioral outcomes, it's culturally inclusive, they have a lot of different studies with a lot of different religions, but it's very social. It focuses purely on religion as a social behavior. And I think most religious communities would argue that it's not just going to church, it's not just praying in groups, it's not just meditating in groups. There's something sort of intersubjective about the religious experience. So this is a study more directly toward that. This is Tanya Luhrmann, who's actually an anthropologist, and Howard Nussbaum, both formerly at the University of Chicago, which is why one of the reasons I bring him up. And Tanya Luhrmann did an in-depth study of evangelical Christians in the Vineyard Church in Evanston, Illinois, and found that one of the interesting things that these evangelicals would do is practice how to hear and interpret God. And so they would do things like set out a table setting, and they would for dinner, and they would have a space for God that would sit. And so when they were praying or interacting, they would learn to treat God as though God is always present, and try to mentally represent that when praying. And so what they did was they took that idea and said, in order to do that, you have to be very good at absorbing yourself into a situation, to imagine things, and then really find that imagination compelling. And they found that people who really reported hearing a lot of God or having direct communications with God were higher on a trait called absorption, the capacity to look at a painting for hours on end. So that's a really neat study because it looked at a very specific cultural group, very specific practice, and looked at a single construct, so there's not a lot of messiness in it. and found this interesting psychological mechanism, which, while not necessarily explaining all of religious experience, might be something that I think helps people be religious, which is a cool thing to find. But however, this is hard to generalize because it was a study of 35 people who were particularly involved in this class, and absorption is an understudied construct. We don't actually know a lot about absorption. We're starting to learn more, but until Tanya Luhrmann had been using it, we'd actually kind of forgotten as a psychology discipline that the scale existed. I think she used it for the first time in 20 years. So we're going to move on to my project now, but that gives you a general sense of the methods in which people are studying religious experience, because it is very hard to study. And so we're going to first talk about why would I bother to study epilepsy if I'm interested in religious experience. Epilepsy has a long history of being considered sacred or religiously granted, I should say. Some people point to the birth of modern medicine as Hippocrates convincing people that epilepsy and epileptic seizures were not gifts from the gods. He said it is a disease. And so for quite some time, the kinds of experiences people would have during seizure have been associated with religious experience. And what's interesting from a study perspective for Alistair and I is that religious experience and epilepsy are not practiced. People just kind of get them as a symptom of their disease. And so unlike the monk studies, unlike Tanya Luhrmann's study, we had the advantage of people who weren't expecting to have religious experiences having religious experiences, which gives us kind of a nice naturally occurring experiment, as much as you can with something that's so culturally bound. Thankfully for us, also, epilepsy is not a culturally bound disease. Epilepsy doesn't care where you're from, so we can get a wide sampling of cultures, as best we can anyway, given the limitations of what hospitals we're in. So we're going to give you a quick epilepsy crash course because it's a big field. I promise you'll be experts by the end of this minute. So epilepsy is the most common neurological disease in the world, and you see pretty consistent rates across cultures. You see some higher rates of epilepsy in economically disadvantaged cultures. I think it has a lot more to do with medicines and seizure control than it does with anything about poverty. An epileptic seizure is broadly defined as a transient occurrence or signs or symptoms due to abnormal, excessive, or synchronous neuronal activity in the brain. Essentially, things are firing when they shouldn't be firing. And epilepsy, I think, challenging for our research, is simply the tendency to have seizures. The propensity to have epileptic seizures is the only thing that defines epilepsy as a disease. And so you have a large range of things that could be causing this epilepsy, all under one large umbrella. So we're going to have to break it down a bit more. So we have major categories of seizures. This recently is, oh, no, wrong button. The ILEA has redone these categories again in 2015, which is very helpful for my process of learning them. So stop doing that. So you have generalized tonic-clonic seizures. I think most people are familiar with these. The sort of body convulsions, unconsciousness, people falling to the floor. I think it's what we typically associate with epilepsy. There are also, however, focal seizures in which you don't have the electrical activity crossing the brain. And so you have very localized electrical disturbances. And you can see in these very specialized or idiosyncratic reactions. So within temporal lobe epilepsy, you often see auras, experiential auras, except. And these are sort of things like deja vu being the most common one, or a sense of fear. This is a small part of the brain acting irregularly and producing an emotion rather than the total loss of consciousness that we see in seizures that cross. And interestingly, many people remember these experiences. Not all of them, but they do. And so the religious content we're interested in is going to be in ictal or post-ictal states. What this means simply is ictal is during seizure, post-ictal is post-seizure, though we're mostly focusing on the ictal experience because we have a complicating factor in that post-ictal events often come with psychosis. And post-ictal psychosis is not, I wouldn't consider a genuine religious experience. People claiming suddenly that they're God incarnate is not really what we're going for here. And that's generally more in the line of mental illness than it is in what we're interested in. So, interesting historical case. There's quite a few, and there's some contentions about which saints or which prophets had epilepsy. I think a lot of the historical data is very speculative, and so I urge you to take all that with a grain of salt. But we know that Fyodor Dostoevsky had epilepsy, and that his religious experiences were in part due to this epilepsy. So he would sometimes describe his seizures as generalized tonic-clonic loss of consciousness, but sometimes he would have these seizures that have an experience that I think is really hard to describe, and I urge you just to read this quote for a minute. It's very powerful. And you see here, you see here the mention of Muhammad, as I said. Some people speculated Muhammad had epilepsy. I don't really know. We haven't seen his brain, so I'm not going to make a claim on that. So Dostoevsky was profoundly moved by the auras he experienced, and he based the character Prince Mishkin in The Idiot after these own experiences. And Prince Mishkin, you may recall, is the only actually smart character in the book. in large part because of his belief in God and his conviction that God exists because, well, he had seen it. So this is in many cases the driving force for people studying epilepsy and religious experience in the contemporary era, which they have been. So we have studies of sense presence. This is a case study in which a Swedish man would have a seizure, and part of that seizure he would feel a comforting presence in the room. They sort of couldn't describe, but he knew that the presence wanted him to be well. And this is associated with temporal lobe activity on both sides. It didn't lateralize. We have a study of intense bliss, Hansen and Brodkorb. That study is the largest study so far, of 11 people. We're hoping to do better than that in our work. But this case here is interesting because it's a woman who had this sense of intense joy and love. And she described it as feeling as though she was a teenager in love again. And she would get these and then later on have to go to the bathroom because sometimes people have to pee after seizure. Most interesting for this participant is that she had another experience which was much more of a direct voice of God, and had it while singing in a church choir in the church in Norway, and was terrified because as an agnostic she thought she was going crazy. So this is interesting to me because it brings up the cultural element of this. Not everyone interprets these things the same way. And so we do have cultural differences in how people understand these experiences. And this will raise a question of authenticity that we can talk about after the talk if you want to talk about it. So we have the unveiling of larger realities. This is the study Alistair mentioned previously when talking about religious conversion. This is an RAF pilot who, while flying, had a seizure, which is very dangerous, and sort of saw the unfolding true nature of the world, landed safely, thankfully, and then converted to Christianity, having been a practicing Christian until I think age 10. So it's a really dramatic experience to have. We have visions, which I think is more typically what people associate with some of this. The interesting one here is the Naoto Musi, is a single case of a Japanese woman who would scream, "My God has come, my God the Son, it burns before me," and then would forget that she had it, but she was screaming very loudly. And so she has one case where she remembered it, and it did seem to impact her quite a bit. So we can see a wide range of experiences from a wide range of cultures, all of it are kind of different. We can talk more about specific cultural work later, because I don't have time for it. It's very interesting, but I want to get to patient one. So patient one is our first mystical experience patient. We've done a lot of research, a lot of efforts to try to find people to do our research. So we have 2 pre-screens running in Addenbrooke's Hospital and University College London Hospital. I'm going through all the databases for the surgery database that we have at University College London Hospital. About 600 individual cases as of yesterday, which is why I wasn't here. And it's also very tiring. But we have found this one person. I want to give you a little bit of information about them and talk about the data we have. So we have medical data. So we have good medical data because she's a surgery candidate, which means that they have the scans, week-long video telemetry. We have as much data as you can get on somebody, really. And so you see a person with frequent seizures, sometimes 6 to 8 a day, depending. They come in clusters, so sometimes they're more severe than others. Mostly of the type I described as auras, and right temporal focus, very clear right temporal focus. Previously, it had hippocampal sclerosis, so inflammation of the brain, and then it had temporal lobectomy. So despite having part of the temporal lobe removed, this person still has 8 to 10 seizures a day, and has some very incredible experiences because of it. Transporting auras is the most interesting one. So when I asked about the kind of auras they had, they described being suddenly taken to another place, specifically something akin to like a sanctuary in the sea. And they found it exceptionally comforting and would often feel as though when they had bad experience, like when their life was going poorly, first there's a lot of other medical issues associated with this, that these transportations were a source of strength and the way they knew that they could get through all this trying stuff. He had more typical stuff like deja vu, tend to get kind of emotional, either calm or agitated before these seizures start clustering up, has strong anxiety, can feel very like temperature-wise hot, and then have epigraphic rising, or the sense that your stomach's kind of just like flying up like this. What's really interesting to me about this person is, well, we'll get to it in a second. We have 5 scales that we're administering. I've only analyzed one because it doesn't help to look at 5 scales with one participant. But that absorption scale I mentioned, this person had a 34 of 34 in terms of trait absorption. So including that has been, I think, very interesting. I did a 40-minute interview with this person. I talked a lot about their auras, a lot about what it meant for their life, a lot about their religious upbringing. And this is a person for whom this transporting aura, this sense of calm and safety, has been a guiding force for their sort of reemergence into spirituality. This is someone who was raised in a very dysfunctional home religiously. Grandmother had called this person a witch because of the seizures they were having, and has, due to these experiences, really taken to a sort of faith again. Sort of informal going to church, maybe once a month or so, but intense daily activity in spirituality. That's actually something we predict might be occurring with a lot of these people, is that having the sudden revelation of a deity or an ultimate reality thrust upon you, you may not find all the ritual of church that compelling. And so these people are going to be very spiritual, but may not be deeply involved in organized religion. This person's also getting another surgery, and described a fear of losing these, a concern that this sense of safety and comfort when gone would be something that they'd miss. And there's some anxiety engaged with that. And like I said, this is all very temple of focus, which squares well with the Persinger studies. But I think this is a much more rich description of the religious experience in the life of this person. So the abstract says something about process and context, and I'm thus bound to talk about it. What I think is useful about the study is it does a couple things. Being interdisciplinary and being holistic, we avoid inappropriate reductionism. So it's looking like the temporal lobe is very important for the sort of intense mystical experiences we're interested in. That doesn't mean we've explained away intense mystical experiences. We simply said we found an area of the brain that is involved in it. It could be mechanistic, it could be receptive. It really depends more, my alarm, on the theology that you hold. And we are deferring to religious communities when talking about authenticity. This addresses questions of general mechanism, as I've kind of explained, but it also addresses questions of specific subjectivity. So looking at the actual experience of having these kind of seizures and these kind of auras, and really breaking down in depth as to what they're like as best we can from a secondary perspective. And I've analyzed maybe 10 minutes of this 45-minute interview on the subject, so we're going to be trying to get a lot more of that soon. And this avoids diminishing personally important experiences. We're not telling this person they're wrong. We're just interested in how it happens in the brain. So with that, I want to thank you, and I want to ask, what are your questions?
Well, thanks so much, Joe. I hope that stimulated a few questions around the room. So let's see how we go. And there's one right up in the front here who's got who's handling the microphone. The microphone is coming
on its way
forwards, and it's on its way as we speak. Yeah. Very quickly. We're right up the front, Eleanor. Thank
Vanessa.
you very much. Yeah.
One of our
if you
small
keep your hand up,
people.
there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was fascinating. Is there much of a range of interpretation given by the patient themselves? I.e., do some people say, oh, my brain's done something and I've interpreted it in a religious way, but I don't believe in anything religious. Some people actually think it's a genuine experience of a genuine supernatural being. What kind of range of interpretations do the patients give?
You've actually summarized it very well. So there's been more studies in the Japanese context, and one of the things they found is it was very hard to find people who would admit to having a mystical experience, because Japan is, for the most part, a very secular country. And so the ones who were willing to come forward were the ones who had the very unusual ones, and to have these visions of the sutras coming down on a cloud, or visions of unification of all world religions under one new religion. So in some of the classic studies in America and the UK, you see much more Christian attribution. And you see that especially with people who grew up Catholic or involved in Catholic practice, that people are pretty happy to jump on and attribute it that way. And again, this is just an attributional approach. That I'm not saying whether or not these things happen. I'm just saying that typically is the pattern we see.
But how often will they say, I know it's just a physical thing going on in my brain, and I know my brain has given that meaning. They kind of, do you see?
Yeah, so the case in Norway, the one I cited is one of that, where that woman was very clearly saying, I'm hearing the voice of God, which means I need to go to a doctor. So it does happen, absolutely, but they're also absolutely sincere believers, which I think is one of what makes this interesting, is we're seeing religious attribution in sort of real time and trying to understand what variables might predict who would really fall in and believe and who might not. We're getting a lot of scales on previous religious history in order to try to assess whether there's any variables that would predict that upbringing, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a question back here, Eleanor. If you can keep your hand up, just so that Eleanor can see. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Have you ascertained any measured personality changes with people suffering from epilepsy over a period of a number of years? Has that been part of your research?
So unfortunately, no, because we don't know who these people are. So we're actively finding out who has the experiences we're interested in. And it's very challenging to do retroactive longitudinal data, because people already kind of are formed to the personalities they have now. There have been studies trying to track people. They're not great because they don't use standardized measures, unfortunately. There has been some speculation of a temporal lobe personality or syndrome. People who typically are very hyper-religious, as the phrase is. They typically have hypergraphia. They write down everything. I'm not actually convinced that that's a syndrome. The best thing we can try to do on that is, as part of our pre-screen, we're comparing the population we recruit to the general population of the pre-screen to see if we see higher trait religiosity. I don't know if we're actually going to find that or not. So it's hard to say, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions?
Oh, surely someone.
I have. Okay, we'll take one there, and I have a question in a moment. So yeah, please. Thank you.
Do these things happen in children, or have you studied children, episodes in children?
So I haven't studied children. We actually are 16 and over for ethical reasons. But I believe there was a case in the voodoo context in Haiti, and there's a couple of cases in Haiti in which people will have seizures and it's attributed to voodoo possession. And I think one of those people is 13 maybe. But she was quickly taken to a spiritual healer, and then later Miami for anticonvulsives. So I can't speak to sort of developmental context, unfortunately.
Joe, I have a question. I mean, generally speaking, when you talk about the brain and special religious experience, people, I think, probably generally think about temporal lobe epilepsy. But how many, as far as the literature is concerned, I mean, how many real cases are there that kind of give that impression? I mean, do we know yet what proportion of people with temporal lobe epilepsy ever have religious experience? Do we know that yet? Or
not at all, no.
we don't know that? Okay.
So unfortunately, so much of this is case studies. And you can hold the literature on this in your hand, which is so rare in anything. So I mean, one of our aims is just to get more than 11 people and to use a standardized scale and some controls. It unfortunately hasn't been done yet, actually. So we're breaking ground and being systematic for once. I think in part because the phenomenon is apparently very rare, if our pre-screen is anything to show for it. I've looked at 600 records, and I think we have about 45 interesting candidates. Mm-hmm. So it definitely is a rare thing, but unfortunately no one's asking this question.
But case studies in the literature, do we know how many there are? I mean, you were holding up your hands like that. I wasn't quite sure if that was a pile of paper or...
It's a pile of paper.
Okay,
this is the literature.
Yeah, well, so 50, 40, hundreds? I mean, do you ever feel...
I don't. So our estimate for proposing this was, if you have epilepsy as a general disease, and then you have temporal lobe epilepsy as a subsection. The largest subsection is still a subsection. And then you have people with auras, which is the subsection of that. Religious auras is probably even smaller. I think based on the rates of epilepsy in the United Kingdom, we estimated at most 100,000 cases in which someone's had one experience, and that's deeply speculative. We're doing our best to find them, but it seems very rare.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other questions? There's one here. No, thank you.
I'm curious about your research methods. How do you calibrate the methods and ensure that you have valid and reliable methodologies?
Sure. So the psychometrics, we're using all established scales. So these have been given to large populations. Most of them have been given cross-culturally. Absorption is the one that hasn't been, but like I said, is kind of a forgotten scale. But it was extensively tested when it was created. So those have been gone through reliability. The actual medical data, I mean, like these are the top quality researchers trying to figure out if this is a good surgery candidate. So they've done multiple scans, week-long EEG with video observation. We have extensive medical record notes. So that stuff's pretty good. And we're not doing direct comparisons, unfortunately. So we acknowledge that this is not going to be a perfect study. But I think just getting more than 11 cases is going to be very powerful. And we will have MRI, some EEG, and extensive case studies on all our participants and our controls, which is another thing, is we have controls that are temporal lobe epilepsy and have an aura, but an aura of fear or deja vu or something non-religious. So we can compare them to the religious experiences. And then we have temporal lobe epilepsy with no experience. So people who kind of absent seizures or something. And then general religious community, which will be interesting, because we have to go find them after the fact to make sure we match the religious traditions with our epileptic population.
Thank you. Yeah, it's worth emphasizing probably that getting this work through the ethical review board is also really challenging. I think, isn't that right, Joe?
It's about a year.
About a year. It took a year to get the ethical permission. Question back here. Yes.
Joe,
Yes.
I wondered if there are any particular religions that come up more. So I'm understanding you're looking at religion in general or mystical experiences. Are you finding at all any pockets that are more likely to want to talk about it or not, or?
So right now, I suspect we're going to see a more forthcoming Christian population, mostly because of the history of the United Kingdom. Like, we are recruiting through the NHS, and we do have non-Christian people we're looking at, but I think we're going to find that to be the most. Actually, yesterday in clinic, I had one of the nurse attendants ask, "Oh, so is it okay if Muslims take part in your study?" I think people assume that Christianity is what people are studying as a religion in the United Kingdom, and so we're going to have to really push to get other groups to come forward. Though I think it seems like they're willing if people are asking you to take part. So that's going to be a cultural thing.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we want to thank Joe very much for a very interesting talk. Thank you, Joe, very much. So,
Thank you.